Hey everybody, you just did a ton of problems where you were solving for x using factoring, right? You were given a trinomial and you had to factor it in order to make it look like zero product property. Now we're going to talk about that last problem on your worksheet that was CBF. And we're going to talk about how on earth you would solve an equation like that. So let's look at this one on the left first. You should feel really, really comfortable with this. You see that you have an x squared term, an x term, and something else. So you're going to try and factor it. So what are factors of 2 that combine in some way to get me a 3? Well, that's 2 and 1. So I do my little x plus 2 times x plus 1, and I get that. And so then, oh, look, two things being multiplied together that are set equal to 0. So either this one equals 0 or this one equals 0. So you do your little solvey solve solve, and you get that x equals -2 or -1. If you don't feel comfortable with that, go ahead and watch the previous video again. I want to make sure that you feel really, really good about that because you need to be able to compare it to what we see on the right. So again, same sort of thing. I see an x squared term, an x term, and something else. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to try and factor it. What are factors of 3 that combine to give me a 6? Shoot, there aren't any. This is CBF. And does CBF mean then that it's NRS, that there's no real solution? No, not necessarily. So just because you can't factor something does not mean that you can't solve it. So we're going to talk about how on earth you would solve that. And you use something called the quadratic formula. Ba-ba-da-ba. So super exciting. The quadratic formula is wild, but you're going to love it because it gives you a lot of power. So we got to talk about something first before we get into the quadratic formula. So we've talked before about how anything with an x squared term is what we call a quadratic expression, a quadratic equation. So sort of the typical form of a quadratic equation is what you see right here. And this A, B, C are just the leading coefficients or the constant in a quadratic equation. So for example, we have a quadratic equation right here. And I want you to pause the video and tell me what the A, B, and C would be. All right, we're back. So hopefully you said that your leading coefficient in front of your A was a 1. So even though you don't see a 1, is understood. Your B is a 4, and your C is a -10. You're always going to take the sign that's in front of whatever number you're talking about. And that's really, really important. And you'll see why in a second. Okay, so if we have a situation like this, so I'm trying to drive this home again. So I see an x squared term, an x term, and I see something else. I know I'm going to try and factor it. So right here, I'm going to look for factors of 2 that combine in some way to get me a 4. And there aren't any. And so this, we would say, is C, B, F. But the directions do not say factor this. The directions say solve for x. So we have to be able to do it. And here is how we do it. The quadratic formula is using a quadratic equation. So remember, a quadratic equation is written on the left. And this is what a quadratic formula is. We use those leading coefficients, A and B, and then the constant C. And we use those numbers in this quadratic formula. Put your pencils down, and I want you just to soak this up, and then you can write it down later. So here's how it goes. We can solve for x by doing the following. X equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. And then all of that is over 2 times a. And you're probably looking at this and you're like, what is going on? And I totally get it. This is legit. This comes from somewhere, and it comes from that quadratic equation. And we derive it from that. I can show you if you're interested later. So I promise this is not made up. But the best way to remember this is by singing a little song. So here we go. Cue third hand, second hand embarrassment. Here we go. Me, 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 me. X equals -b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Hey, I would like you to memorize this. Yes, I know. You can sing the song, you can write it down a million times, but you definitely want to memorize this so you feel comfortable with it. By all means, write this down and keep it on a little sticky next to your desk or down on your homework or whatever, because you're going to want to use this and reference it as you're memorizing it. Okay, so here's the quadratic formula, and we're going to see it a bunch more in the next few questions. All right, so here's a question. So we are told we need to solve for x. So I see an x squared term, an x term, and something else. I'm going to first try to factor. So I ask myself, are there any factors of 9 that combine to give me a 1? Because remember, the leading coefficient here is an understood 1. And there's no way I can do that, right? I can't factor it. So then I know I can use the quadratic formula. So if it is C, B, F, you're going to quad it up, okay? If it's CBF, you're going to quad it up. Because remember, like we did like an x squared term, an x term, and nothing else, that's ZPP. This is sort of like the same kind of mental move that you want to take. So anytime it's CBF, you're going to quad it up. So the first thing you've got to do is write down what your A, your B, and your C are. So A is 1, B is also 1, and C is -9. And here we go. So x equals negative b, so that's a -1, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4, and then a is 1, and then c is -9, and then it's going to be all over 2 times a. Good? All right, so here's what we wind up getting. If we simplify this out, we get x equals, we still have that -1, plus or minus, and up here, we get x squared, so I'm sorry, 1 squared, which is 1, and then minus, and then 4 times 1 is 4, times -9 is -36. But if it's minus a -36, it becomes plus 36. So we wind up getting, under the square root, the number 37, and then over 2. And guess what? You're done. That's all you have to do. Do you see how you can't simplify the square root of 37? You can't go to prom with 37. And so that's all you can do. That is how you solve a quadratic equation using the quadratic formula. So let's try another one, and this one's a little bit more complicated. So again, x squared term, x term, and something else. I can't factor it. So if it's CBF, I'm going to quad it up. So the first thing I need to do is I need to get my A, my B, and my C. Please, please, please write these out. So A is 1, B is 6, and C is 3. So x equals negative B, so -6, plus or minus the square root of 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times 3, and then all over 2 times 1. So now I want you to pause the video and try and simplify this on your own. All right, we're back. So hopefully you got this. X equals -6, and then plus or minus. And right here, you're going to get 36 minus 12. So you should get the square root of 24 up top, and then that's over 2. But this is not fully simplified yet. So we can't just box this answer like we did before. We've got to simplify it. So square root of 24, can we go to prom here? Yeah, let's do 12 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 2 and 2. So we get 2's go to prom, remember this? So 2's go to prom, and then 3 and 2 stay home, right? We've got a pair of 2's, they go to prom, 3 and 2 stay home and multiply. So you get 2 root 6. So my answer here becomes -6 plus or minus 2 root 6 over 2. But you are not done, because you can divide everything through by 2 here. So you wind up getting -3 plus or minus root 6. You can't divide the 6 underneath the square root by 2 because 6 is still kind of staying at home, right? It's its own thing underneath the radical, but you can divide both this -6 and this 2 by this 2 in the denominator. So this one's a little bit more complicated. All right, I have one more to show you. So let's try this one. So here's a good little rule of thumb. Whenever you see a leading coefficient like this and you can't divide it out, remember how we talked about like that was kind of our first step with factoring? So I can't divide it out here, right? I can't take a 3 out of each term. But what's nice is the quadratic formula will always work. So if I'm solving for x, I'm just going to write down what my a, my b, and my c are. So I get a is 3, b is 6, and c is 5. So here we go. -6 plus or minus the square root. 6 squared is 36 minus 4 times 3 times 5. And then it's all over 2 times 3. Now something funky happens here. Look, I get underneath my square root, I get 36 minus 4 times 3 is 12, and 12 times 5 is 60. Shoot, what happens underneath my square root here? I wind up getting a negative value. And when that happens, your answer here is going to be NRS, because you got a negative underneath your square root. But remember, you've got to be really, really careful with your signs so that you make sure that you take those into account, because you're going to wind up with like a lot of NRSs when you shouldn't. So just be careful with that. All right. So one last little thing I wanted to show you. So here's what's cool. Let's say I can factor something. So factors of 4 that combine in some way to get me a 5. Well, that's easy. X plus 4 times x plus 1. And I solve, and I get x equals -4 or -1. Amazing. But guess what? The quadratic formula will also work here. So the quadratic formula works all the time. So let's say that you're like struggling factoring, or you see one like on the previous slide and you see that it's like a leading coefficient and you're like, I hate factoring those. You can always just quad it up, which is so fantastic. So let's do it quadratic formula style. So my A, B, and C. So A is 1, B is 5, and C is 4. So x equals -5 plus or minus square root. So b squared is 25 minus 4 times 1 times AC times 4. There we go. And then all over 2 times 1. And look what happens underneath my square root. This 25 minus 4 times 4, 25 minus 16 is 9. So look what happens. X equals -5 plus or minus the square root of 9 divided by 2. And what's the square root of 9? 3. So x equals -5 plus or minus 3 over 2. And this plus or minus is kind of funky, right? Here's how it works out in our favor. -5 plus 3 divided by 2, and -5 minus 3 divided by 2. What's -5 plus 3? So -2. Wait, -2 divided by 2 is -1. Ha 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 ha. Wait a second. And then look at the bottom one. -5 minus 3 is -8. And -8 divided by 2 is -4. What? Kind of cool, right? All right, go tackle the worksheet. You're going to crush it. And don't worry, we're going to go over all of this. So have fun. See you soon.